Hey friends, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name is Bianca, and today I would like to shed some light on a topic that can often feel like navigating the maze in the dark: startup valuations. I decided to create this guide because I happen to notice a gap in understanding amongst many entrepreneurs and investors. So, this video aims to offer you a peek into how the valuation process works. But do remember, I am not a financial advisor. I just so happen to be someone who has been in the trenches and wants to share some insights that may help you in your journey. Make sure to take what's useful for you and simply ignore what doesn't apply to you. Let's dive right in. Now, where do we start on this intriguing journey of startup valuation? I suppose we can first break it down into a few key areas. First of all, what is valuation and why does it even matter? Now, imagine you're at an auction standing in front of this super rare piece of art. If you think about it, its value isn't simply just about the canvas or the type of paint that the artist used, but it is also about the artist's vision, the time it took for the person to create that piece of work, and also the potential of that piece of art to appreciate its value in the future. So similarly, valuation is pretty much the process of trying to determine the economic worth of a startup. And this matters a lot because it is the key to opening doors in the future for potential investors as well as funding. This therefore brings us to consider, why is valuing a startup as much of an art as it is science? Well, valuing a startup isn't exactly as simple as summing up all of its assets as well as revenue streams, especially if your startup is in its really early stages. It's kind of like trying to predict the final score at the beginning of a sports game. There's potential, there's talent, but there are no guarantees. Hence, the captivating dance between all these elements makes startup valuation such a challenging yet a very fascinating process. Having said that, selecting the right valuation method is a lot like choosing the right type of camera lens to view your startup through. So, let's explore some popular valuation methods and what they entail. The first one would be the venture capital method. This is kind of like planning for a cross-country trip where you have to take into account various factors such as price of petrol, food, or even lodging that your peers have taken, followed by adjusting everything according to your personal preferences. Similarly, this method basically looks at what a startup might be worth in the future, followed by the potential revenue it is able to generate, as well as the kind of returns that its investors want to see. The end result gives an idea of what the startup's post-money valuation would be. And post-money valuation is basically the value of the company after the investor's funding has been injected. Generally speaking, as its name probably have already suggests, this is probably one of the most common and popular valuation methods that many VCs love to use. Moving on, we have the comparable transactions method. Think of this valuation method to be akin to buying a car, where you try to compare prices of similar makes, models, and conditions to get an idea of what you're willing to pay for. Similarly, you'll start investigating what investors have paid for a stake in another startup that's operating in a somewhat similar manner as yours, whether it is in terms of the sector, size, revenue, or perhaps the stage of growth. These comparables then help you gauge what is a rough ballpark figure that your startup could be worth. However, it's important to always bear in mind that this method has its limitations because there are no two companies that are exactly the same, and their individual circumstances can also have a great impact on their company value. Besides that, there is this discounted cash flow or DCF method. Now, imagine that one day you're walking home and you stumble upon this magical fruit tree that gives a certain number of fruits every year for the next 10 years. How much would you be willing to pay for that fruit tree today? To figure the maths out, you basically need to consider how many fruits you're able to get each year, and also account for the fact that the same fruit available this year is much more valuable than the same fruit that's available, 10 years later. And this concept is the crux of the DCF method. In a startup's context, the DCF method basically values the company based on its expected future cash flows, or let's just say in really simple terms, the amount of money that the company is expected to generate in the future. These future cash flows are then discounted back to its present value. But the problem you gotta bear in mind is that startups often don't have stable or predictable cash flows, so it makes it really hard for this method to be applied accurately. It basically requires you to make a lot of assumptions about the startup's future performance and growth. And even the smallest changes in these assumptions can actually have a significant impact on its valuation. Therefore, whilst the DCF approach is probably one of the most sound and most popular method used by Wall Street analysts to value established businesses, it may not entirely be suitable for early stage startups. Next in line, we have the cost to duplicate method. To keep it really simple, let's just consider this approach to be similar to asking the question, okay, if I got to rebuild this startup from scratch, how much would it cost? So this would basically include the cost of developing the product or proprietary technology, the physical assets, or even recruiting a similarly capable team to achieve that. This method usually gives you a baseline valuation, but the problem is that it doesn't exactly account for intangible assets such as the company's brand image or the founding team's skill sets. And these factors can all actually make the startup even more valuable. Other than that, there is the scorecard method. So try to picture a singing competition where each of the candidates are evaluated based on things like their vocal quality, their stage presence, or even stuff like their song choice. Similarly, the scorecard method basically scores each startup based on a set of predefined criteria. So it could be things like the strength of the management team, the size of the target market, the uniqueness of the product or services that they offer, followed by comparing them to industry averages. Just like how the contestant with the highest score would therefore have a higher chance of winning, the startup with the highest score in this case would be able to command a much higher valuation. And finally, we have the Berkus method. Think of it like grading a restaurant based on its food quality, service, ambience, cleanliness, and value. In the startup realm, this method basically assesses the startup based on 5 key components. So a sound idea, a functional product, having a quality management team, the number of strategic relationships or partnerships it has, as well as the product rollout or sales performance. Each element, if present, contributes a certain amount of value to your startup, much like how each star has a certain weightage to the restaurant's overall 5-star rating. Now that we have talked about some of the popular valuation methods out there, come to think about it, picking the right valuation method to value your startup is kind of like picking the right key to pick your lock. Generally speaking, it is highly dependent on a few different factors such as the nature of the business itself, the industry it happens to be operating in, the stage of the company, the geographic market, as well as the general financial climate it is situated in. So let's just say we take the business nature into account. Tech companies may prefer the Berkus method or the VC method because of its high growth and scalability potential. And then when it comes to the industry aspect of things, startups operating in already established industries might prefer the scorecard method because benchmarks and industry averages are readily available. Moving on, let's say for the stage of the business itself, super early stage startups, like say pre-revenue stage startups, may prefer the cost to duplicate or Berkus method because of their limited historical data. Besides that, the location of the startup can greatly impact its valuation, but it's not as straightforward as emerging market equals higher valuation. The dynamics of the market itself, as well as the local challenges and opportunities, all come into play. On top of that, a startup's location can also impact its ability to access certain customer base or even resources, and its performance can also be greatly dictated by certain regulatory conditions. So in some cases, startups that are operating in emerging markets with favorable business conditions may get a higher valuation. But in some instances, startups operating in developed markets may be able to command a much higher valuation because they have access to a much more mature ecosystem as well as an established infrastructure. And finally, when it comes to the financial climate aspect of things, it wouldn't be too surprising to hear about investors paying a premium during a boom period and thereby elevating a startup's valuation. But remember, there really isn't this one-size-fits-all option to value a company, let alone a startup. at the end of the day, the price that someone pays is really dependent on the bargaining power between the entrepreneur and the investor, as well as the overall sentiment in the market. On top of that, valuation is only really one part of the entire deal structuring process. And that's because the type of financial instruments used, as well as the protection that the entrepreneur is able to offer to investors, can also play a pivotal role in the entire decision-making process. Meanwhile, in cases where traditional valuation methods aren't exactly the right fit, alternatives such as SAFEs, or aka simple agreement for future equity, or even convertible notes may actually come into play. For starters, SAFEs are usually employed to simplify seed stage investments. To keep it simple, when an investor invests in a startup using a SAFE note, they're basically buying the right to own part of the company in the future. It's kind of like saying, hey, I'll give you money, but in return, you give me shares in your company when you're more established. It's not a loan, so there's no interest or need to pay the capital back. On the other hand, convertible notes are basically short-term debt that gets converted into equity later on. They are usually employed when determining the value of a startup is quite difficult or might lead to disagreements that would halt the entire funding process. So at this point in time, I suppose you'll probably realize that startup valuation is pretty much a type of art as well as a type of science. With that, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it to be incredibly enlightening, do please consider hitting the like, subscribe, and bell icon. It really helps. And if you happen to be interested to learn more about how VCs review pitch decks, do check out a video I've made on that. Till then, I wish you a pleasant day ahead, be kind to yourself and others, and I shall see you in my next video. Bye bye!